The war was over. At least that is what Commander Vrak of the Dothene Empire declared from his tall throne of black stone, his 4 arms spread wide, his deep violet eyes gleaming with satisfaction. The hall around him was enormous, carved from the rock of a dead moon, lit by burning blue torches that never seemed to go out. Hundreds of Dothene warriors stood in perfect rows, their armored bodies still and silent, watching their commander with expressions of total loyalty. Caleb Morrison stood in the middle of all of it, feeling very small. He was a tall man by human standards, broad shoulders, short dark hair, a calm face that rarely showed what he was thinking. He wore the simple gray uniform of the human diplomatic corps. No medals, no weapons. Just a man in a gray jacket standing in a room full of alien soldiers who could probably crush him with one hand. He had been sent here 6 months ago as a liaison, a bridge between the human coalition and the Dothene Empire. His job was simple in theory. Talk, listen, keep the peace, help the Dothene resolve their border conflict with the Suhari without anyone blowing up a solar system. It had not been simple. There had been 3 near disasters, 2 failed ceasefires, and 1 very tense night where Caleb had stayed awake for 31 hours straight talking both sides off the edge of a full-scale war. He had used logic, patience, cultural research, and at one point, a shared meal of something that smelled terrible but apparently meant deep respect in Dothene culture. He had eaten it without flinching. That alone had earned him more trust than any document he had signed. And now it was done. The treaty was signed. The border was settled. Nobody was dead who did not have to be. Commander Vrak stepped down from his throne and walked toward Caleb with the slow, heavy steps of a being who had never once rushed for anything. He was nearly 3 meters tall, covered in dark gray scales, with a face that was all sharp angles and hard lines. He looked at Caleb the way someone might look at a strange little animal they had grown unexpectedly fond of. "Human," Vrak said, his voice a deep rumble that Caleb felt more in his chest than heard with his ears. "You have done what my own generals could not. You have brought peace to this empire's border without a single Dothene life lost." Caleb gave a small nod. "That was the goal." "You are modest." Vrak tilted his massive head. "Among my people, that is considered either a great virtue or a great weakness. I have not yet decided which you are." "I'll take either one," Caleb said. A low sound moved through the Dothene warriors around them, something between a grunt and a laugh. Caleb had learned that it meant amusement. Good. Vrak turned and lifted one large hand. From the far side of the hall, 2 Dothene soldiers appeared, walking slowly. Between them, connected to them by a thin chain of dark metal, walked a figure unlike anything else in the room. She was not Dothene. She was slender and not very tall, with skin the color of pale silver that seemed to catch the blue torchlight and hold it softly. Her hair was white and long, falling loosely around her face. Her eyes, when they briefly lifted before dropping again to the floor, were a deep and quiet amber, like old honey held up to sunlight. She wore simple gray clothes, worn at the edges. Her wrists were bound together with the same dark chain. She did not struggle. She did not look up. She simply walked where she was led, with the careful stillness of someone who had learned long ago that stillness was safer. Caleb felt something tighten in his chest. "This," said Vrak, with the tone of a man presenting the finest treasure in his collection, "is Lyra. She is Valorian, one of the last. Among my people, a Valorian slave is the highest honor a warrior can be gifted." He looked at Caleb with something close to pride. "She is yours, for what you have done for the Dothene Empire." The hall was completely silent. Caleb looked at the girl, Lyra, and she did not look back at him. Her eyes stayed on the floor. Her hands were very still in their chains. He looked back at Vrak. Every careful, political, diplomatic part of his brain was screaming at him to be careful, to smile, to accept gracefully and deal with it later, to not create an incident. The treaty was freshly signed. The peace was fragile. One wrong word in this hall could unravel 6 months of exhausting work. He knew all of that. He also knew that there was a living person standing 3 meters away from him, chained at the wrists, being handed to him like a piece of furniture. Caleb kept his face calm. He gave a slow, respectful nod to Vrak. "You honor me, Commander," he said carefully, "more than I can properly express right now." Vrak seemed pleased by that answer. He did not notice, or perhaps did not understand, that Caleb had not said yes. Later that evening, in the small quarters assigned to him on the Dothan base, Caleb sat across from Lyra in the dim light. The chain had been transferred to a ring on the wall. She sat on the floor near it, her knees drawn up, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere past him. Caleb leaned forward, rested his elbows on his knees, and looked at her quietly for a moment. Then he said in a voice that was low and completely steady, "I'm going to get those off you, tonight." For the first time, Lyra looked at him. Her amber eyes were cautious, cold, and exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. She did not say a word, but she did not look away either, and Caleb took that as a start. Caleb did not wait until morning. He found the lock on Lyra's chain within minutes of the Dothan guard leaving them alone. It was a simple mechanical lock, heavy and old-fashioned, the kind that did not need a code or a key card. It needed a thin tool and a steady hand. Caleb had both. He had grown up fixing old engines with his father in a small garage in Ohio, and that kind of patience never really left a person. He knelt down in front of her, tools in hand, and looked up at her face before touching anything. "I'm going to take this off," he said quietly. "I just want you to know what I'm doing before I do it." Lyra watched him. She did not move. She did not speak. But she did not pull away either, and Caleb decided that was enough. It took him 4 minutes. When the chain fell away from the wall ring and then loosened from her wrists, he set it down on the floor carefully, like it was something that deserved to be treated with contempt. He did not throw it. He did not make a speech. He simply stood up, walked to the other side of the small room, and sat down on the edge of his sleeping cot. He picked up a small book he had been reading, an actual paper book, worn at the corners, and opened it. He did not watch her. He did not wait for a reaction. He simply gave her the room. Lyra sat very still for a long time. Then slowly she brought her wrists up close to her face and looked at them. The skin there was marked, not bleeding but pressed and worn, in the way skin gets when something has been wrapped around it for far too long. She touched the marks with her fingertips very gently, and something moved across her face that was hard to name. Not happiness, not relief exactly, something quieter than both of those things. She looked at Caleb. He was reading his book. She looked at the door. It was not locked from the inside. She looked back at Caleb. He turned a page. Lyra slowly pulled her knees back up to her chest and rested her chin on them and said nothing. And Caleb said nothing. And the night passed around them in a strange and careful quiet. In the morning, Denny Cole came by. Denny was 26 years old from a small town in Montana, and he had the kind of face that always looked slightly worried even when nothing was wrong. He was Caleb's second-in-command on the diplomatic vessel and one of the few people Caleb genuinely trusted. He stepped inside, saw Lyra sitting freely on the floor with no chain, and then looked at Caleb with exactly the expression Caleb had expected. "You removed the chain," Denny said. "I did," said Caleb. "Sir," Denny said slowly, the way a person says a word when they are trying to hold a longer sentence inside it. "Gifting a slave to someone and then having that someone remove the chains is considered, among the Dothan, a direct insult to the giver." "I know," said Caleb. "Commander Vrak will hear about it." "He probably already has," Caleb said, pouring himself a cup of coffee from the small machine on the desk. He offered one to Denny, who shook his head with the look of a man who needed something much stronger. "What do we do if he demands she be returned?" Denny asked. "We deal with that when it comes," Caleb said simply. "Right now, I need you to get a translation unit set up in here. A good one, the kind that handles Valorian dialect." Denny looked at Lyra. She was watching both of them with those quiet amber eyes. her expression unreadable. "Yes, sir," Denny said, and left without another word, though the worried look on his face had deepened considerably. The translation unit arrived within the hour. It was a small, flat device that sat on the table between them and processed spoken language in both directions with only a short delay. Caleb set it down, sat across from Lyra, and then did something she clearly did not expect. He asked her what she wanted to eat. She stared at him. He waited. She said nothing for a moment, and then she spoke. Her voice was low and a little rough from what sounded like long disuse, and the translator turned her words into flat, even English. She said she did not know what food he had. Caleb listed what was available on the ship. Simple things, protein portions, grain-based meals, some fruit that had been kept in cold storage. When he mentioned something called Earth Apple, she was quiet for a moment and then said very carefully that she would try that. He brought her two. She ate slowly, watching him the whole time, and he did not stare back. He just sat at his desk and worked on his reports and let her eat in peace. After a while, through the translator, she said, "You are waiting for me to trust you." "No," he said, not looking up from his screen. "I'm just giving you space to decide what you want to do. Those are different things." She was quiet again for a long time. Then she said, "I was a scholar before." Caleb looked up then. "What did you study?" "Plants," she said. "Interstellar botanical systems, how plants from different planets share root behaviors even without shared evolution." She paused. "It sounds unimportant." "It sounds fascinating," Caleb said, and he meant it. Something very small shifted in her expression. Not a smile, not yet, but something that had been pulled tight inside her loosened just slightly, like a knot given one careful tug. That afternoon, without planning to, Caleb went to his cabin and came back carrying a small clay pot with a single succulent in it. A stubby, quiet little earth plant with thick green leaves that needed almost nothing to survive. He had been keeping it on his windowsill for 3 months. It was not much to look at. He set it on the floor near where she usually sat. He did not explain why. He did not say anything about it at all. Lyra looked at the plant for a long moment. Then she reached out and very gently touched one of the thick leaves with one silver fingertip. She did not thank him. She did not give it back either. And somewhere in that small and quiet act, something began. Not loudly, not quickly, but the way most real things begin. Slowly and with great care, and without either of them fully realizing it was happening at all. The message arrived on the 3rd day. It came through the official Dothan communication channel, which meant it appeared on every screen on the ship at the same time, in large, bold text, impossible to miss or ignore. Denny saw it first, and walked straight to Caleb's quarters without knocking, which was something he only did when things were genuinely bad. Caleb was sitting at his desk. Lyra was on the other side of the room, cross-legged on the floor near the small window, the clay pot with the succulent placed carefully beside her. She had moved it there herself the previous evening without saying anything about it. She was currently looking at it the way a person looks at something they are slowly deciding to care about. Denny placed a small screen on Caleb's desk and stepped back. Caleb read the message. Commander Vrock's words were formal and cold, the way Dothan official language always was, like every sentence had been carved out of stone rather than written. The message said that the human liaison had dishonored the gift of the Dothan Empire by removing the binding chains from a gifted slave. It said that this act was considered under Dothan custom an open rejection of the Empire's goodwill. It demanded the immediate return of Lyra to Dothan custody, and at the very end, in language that was careful but clear, it suggested that failure to comply would place the newly signed peace treaty under serious review. Caleb read it twice. Then he set the screen down and drank the rest of his coffee, which had gone cold. "They're threatening the treaty," Denny said. "I read it," Caleb said. "Headquarters is going to contact us within the hour," Denny said. "They monitor all official Dothan communications. They already know." "I know," Caleb said. Denny sat down across from him. He looked tired in the way that people look when they have been carrying worry for several days straight without putting it down. "Caleb," he said, dropping the formal address the way he only did in private, "what are we going to do?" Caleb looked across the room at Lyra. She had heard everything. The translation unit was still active on the table. She was no longer looking at the plant. She was looking at the floor, her expression very still, her hands resting quietly in her lap. She had the look of someone who had heard their fate being discussed before and knew how to make themselves small while it happened. Caleb looked back at Denny. "I'm going to file a formal objection," he said, "through the Human Diplomatic Charter. Article 9, Section 4. It states that no representative of the human coalition may participate in, accept, or facilitate the ownership of any sentient being, regardless of local custom or political context." Denny stared at him. "You're going to use charter law against the Dothene Empire?" "I'm going to use charter law to protect a person," Caleb said, "which is what it exists for." Denny was quiet for a moment. Then he said very carefully, "Headquarters may not back you on this." "Then Headquarters and I will have a conversation," Caleb said. Headquarters contacted them 40 minutes later, as Denny had predicted. The call came from a senior coordinator named Paul Greer, a man in his 50s with a neat gray beard and the permanently exhausted expression of someone who had been managing diplomatic crises for 30 years. He appeared on the screen looking like a man who had been hoping for a quiet week. "Caleb," he said, skipping any greeting, "I have read Vrak's message and I have read your preliminary objection filing. I need you to explain your position to me clearly and quickly." "My position is simple," Caleb said. "I was given a living person as a gift. I freed her. I will not return her." Paul rubbed his forehead. "You understand what is at stake here. This treaty took 6 months. It stabilizes an entire border sector. If Vrak pulls out of a peace treaty because I refuse to keep a person in chains," Caleb said, "then we need to have a much larger conversation about what kind of partner the Dothene Empire actually is." Paul was quiet for a long moment. "File your full objection," he said finally, his voice lower. "I'll see what I can do on this end, but Caleb, be careful." The screen went dark. Caleb turned around. Lyra was standing up. She had moved from the window without him noticing, and she was now standing in the middle of the room, closer than she had ever voluntarily stood to him. Her amber eyes were looking directly at his face, and there was something in them that had not been there before. Not warmth exactly, not yet, but something that had replaced the cold exhaustion that had lived there since the first night. She opened her mouth, and then slowly and carefully she spoke. Not through the translator, in English. It was accented and a little rough at the edges, but it was clear. "You are a fool," she said, "a very large fool." Caleb looked at her for a moment. Then one corner of his mouth moved upward, just slightly. "Probably," he said. She looked at him the way someone looks at a thing they cannot quite explain. "You are risking everything you built here, 6 months of work, for me." "Yes," he said simply. "Why?" she said. It was not really a question. It was more like something she was turning over slowly, trying to find the shape of it. "Because it was the right thing," he said. "That's all." Lyra looked at him for a long time without speaking. Then she said quietly, in that careful, broken English she had been secretly learning from his crew for days without anyone asking her to, "I have heard that answer before, from people who did not mean it." "I know," Caleb said. "You don't have to believe me yet." She held his gaze for one more moment. Then she turned and walked back to the window and sat down beside the small clay pot, and she did not say anything else. But she had spoken to him, directly and in his own language, and by her own choice. And outside the ship, somewhere in the dark between stars, Vrak's warships were already beginning to move. 3 Dothene warships appeared on the radar at dawn. Denny was the one who saw them first. He stood at the navigation console on the small bridge of their diplomatic vessel, staring at the screen with the particular stillness of a person trying very hard not to panic. The ships were not moving fast. They were not firing anything. They were simply sitting out there in the dark, large and patient, like a reminder that patience and power often look the same from a distance. He called Caleb immediately. Caleb came to the bridge, still pulling on his jacket, looked at the screen for about 4 seconds, and then turned and walked back toward his quarters with the calm, steady pace of someone who had already decided what to do next. Denny followed him. "They're positioning," he said. "Not attacking, but positioning." "I know what they're doing," Caleb said.
"So what are we doing?"
"Filing a formal request for a galactic tribunal." Denny stopped walking. "A tribunal? Article 7 of the Interstellar Rights Framework," Caleb said, sitting down at his desk and pulling up his screen. "It allows any registered diplomatic representative to call for an independent council review when a sentient being's personhood status is in legal dispute. The Dothan signed that framework 230 years ago. It is still binding." Denny leaned against the door frame and looked at the ceiling briefly, the way people do when they are searching for either patience or courage and are not entirely sure which one they need. "Caleb, no one has invoked Article 7 in over 80 years. "That does not mean it stopped working," Caleb said and began typing. Lyra was awake. She had been awake for most of the night, sitting near the window with the small succulent beside her, watching the stars the way she used to watch them from her home planet before everything changed. She had heard Denny's voice through the corridor. She had heard the word tribunal. When Caleb came to find her an hour later, she was already waiting. He sat down across from her and looked at her directly, the way he always did, without looking away or making it uncomfortable. It was something she had noticed about him early on. He looked at her like she was a person worth looking at, not an object, not a curiosity, just a person. "I need to ask you something," he said, "and I need you to answer honestly." "I will try," she said in English. Her English was getting cleaner every day, the rough edges smoothing out like something being carefully shaped. "Your research," he said. "Your botanical work. Do you still have it? Any of it?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she reached up and touched a small spot just behind her left ear, where the silver skin was slightly different in texture. Just slightly, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. "Memory chip," she said quietly. "They did not know it was there, or they did not care enough to remove it." Caleb nodded slowly. "I want to request a galactic tribunal to argue that you are a protected person under interstellar law, and I want to use your research as evidence." He paused. "Not because I need to prove you are valuable. You do not have to be valuable to deserve rights. But the Tribunal Council responds to demonstrated intellectual contribution. It is the language they understand best." Lyra looked at him for a long moment. "You want me to stand in front of a council of alien representatives and present my work?" "Yes. Work that has been sitting unfinished in a chip behind my ear for 2 years," she said. "Yes." She looked down at her hands. The marks on her wrists from the chains had faded to almost nothing now. Almost. "And if they say no," she said quietly, "if the council rules against us?" Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I don't know, but I know that doing nothing is not something I'm willing to do." Lyra looked up at him. Something moved through her amber eyes, something complicated and deep and not yet ready to be named. She gave one small, steady nod. "Then I will do it," she said. The tribunal was held 4 days later aboard a neutral council station that hung in orbit above a cold, gray planet that belonged to no one. It was a wide, circular chamber with high walls and seats arranged in rings, filled with representatives from 11 different species. Some of them were large. Some of them were strange to look at. All of them were watching with the careful attention of beings who dealt in politics and precedent. Commander Vrak sat in the Dothan representative seat with his 4 arms folded and his expression like carved stone. He had brought 2 legal advisors. He looked at Caleb once when Caleb entered the chamber, and the look was not warm. Caleb sat at the claimant's table. Beside him sat Lyra. She was wearing a clean gray coat that one of the crew members, a young woman named Carol, had quietly altered to fit her properly. Her white hair was pulled back from her face. She sat straight and still, and she did not look at Vrak. Caleb presented his argument first. He was calm and clear and used simple language that every translator in the room could carry without losing meaning. He cited Article 7. He cited the framework. He explained what had happened and what was being asked. Then he said, "I would like to present Lyra of Valor, scholar, researcher, and a person." Lyra stood. She reached behind her ear and removed the memory chip with steady fingers and connected it to the council's display system. And then she began to speak. She spoke about root memory in plants that had never shared a planet. She spoke about how seeds carried information across generations that no one had taught them. She spoke about a pattern she had found, a deep and quiet pattern running through botanical life across 6 different star systems that suggested something remarkable about how living things hold on to what matters even when everything around them tries to take it away. The chamber was completely silent. Even Vrak's legal advisors had stopped writing. When she finished, one of the council representatives, an elder from the Mari people, small and very old, leaned forward and asked her 3 questions. Lyra answered all 3 without hesitation. The council took 40 minutes to deliberate. When they returned, the lead representative read the ruling in a flat, official voice. Lyra of the Lore was granted full protected personhood status under interstellar law. The Dothene claim of ownership was dismissed. Commander Vrak was informed that any further attempt to claim or restrict her would be considered a violation of the framework his empire had signed 2 centuries ago. Vrak stood up and left the chamber without a word. The room began to fill with noise again, the low hum of many different species processing what had just happened. Lyra stood very still beside Caleb. She was looking straight ahead at the now empty Dothene seat. Her hands at her sides were not shaking, but only just. Caleb did not say anything immediately. He simply stood beside her in the noise and the light and let the moment be what it was. Then, quietly, she turned to him and asked, "Why did you do all of this?" He looked at her. "Because it was the right thing," he said. The same answer as before, exactly the same. She was quiet for a moment. Then she asked, in a voice that was very soft and very careful, "Can I stay?" Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Outside the wide windows of the council station, the cold gray planet turned slowly below them, and the stars beyond it were very bright. "Yes," he said, "for as long as you want." 6 months passed. They were not easy months. The galaxy did not become simple just because one small corner of it had done the right thing. There were political complications from the Dothene side that took weeks of careful communication to settle. There were human coalition officials who were unhappy with Caleb for a long time, and a few who stayed unhappy. Commander Vrak never sent another message, which was either a good sign or a quiet kind of anger, and nobody was entirely sure which. But the treaty held. That was the important thing. The treaty held, and the border stayed settled, and no one went to war, which meant that all those long, exhausting months of work had not been wasted after all. Caleb was reassigned as expected, but the reassignment was not a punishment. It was a posting to a joint human-alien research station called Heron Point, a wide and busy place that floated in a stable orbit between 2 allied systems. It handled diplomatic work and scientific research in equal measure, which made it exactly the kind of place that needed someone like Caleb. Lyra had been offered a position there too, a real one, with a title and a workspace and access to the station's botanical research lab, which was well-funded and full of good equipment. The offer had come from the station's science director, a quiet and serious woman named Dr. Priya Nath, who had read Lyra's tribunal presentation 3 times and contacted her within a week of the ruling. Lyra had accepted. She had not told Caleb she was going to accept before she did it. She had made the decision herself, on her own terms, because she could. And when she told him afterward, he had simply nodded and said, "That was great news," and gone back to packing his things for the transfer. She had stood in the doorway of his quarters watching him pack and felt something warm and strange move through her chest, that she did not immediately have a name for. Heron Point was nothing like the small diplomatic vessel. It was large and full of noise and people of many different species moving through wide corridors with purpose. There were labs and meeting rooms and a shared dining area that always smelled like at least 4 different kinds of food at once. There was a garden section near the center of the station where someone had planted real earth grass in long strips between alien ground cover. And when the station's artificial light hit it at a certain angle in the morning, it looked almost like a field back home. Caleb walked past that garden every day on his way to the diplomatic wing. Lyra's lab was 3 corridors away from his office. They did not plan to see each other every day. They just did. It happened naturally, the way things do when 2 people have already been through something difficult together and find that the habit of being near each other has quietly taken root. They argued sometimes. Lyra was precise and particular about her research and had very firm opinions about methodology. Caleb had a habit of being stubborn when he thought he was right, which was often. They disagreed about small things and occasionally about larger ones, and neither of them backed down easily, and somehow this made the time they spent together feel more honest than comfortable silence ever could. Denny had transferred to Heron Point as well, and watched all of this with the expression of a man watching something obvious happen very slowly. He mentioned it to Carol once, who had also transferred, and Carol said she had noticed it approximately 4 months ago, and Denny said he had noticed it approximately 5 months ago, and they agreed without saying so directly that neither of them was going to say anything about it to either Caleb or Lyra, because some things work better when they are left alone to grow at their own pace. It was a Tuesday evening when things changed, though neither of them would have been able to say later exactly what was different about that particular Tuesday. Caleb had finished a long day of diplomatic correspondence and had gone up to the observation deck on the top level of the station, which was a wide, curved room with a transparent ceiling that looked directly out into open space. It was quiet up there in the evenings. Most people came in the mornings. At night, it was usually empty. Lyra was already there when he arrived. She was sitting on one of the low benches near the center of the room, looking up through the ceiling at the stars. She had a small tablet in her lap, but she was not looking at it. The station's lights were dimmed in the observation deck after a certain hour, so the room was mostly dark, and the stars outside were very bright and very close-looking, the way they always seemed in space, like you could almost reach them. Caleb sat down beside her. Not too close, just close enough. For a while, neither of them said anything. They just sat and looked at the stars together, which was something they had gotten comfortable with over the months, being quiet near each other without it feeling like something was missing. Then Lyra reached across the small space between them and placed her hand over his. Her silver fingers rested gently on the back of his hand. She did not look at him when she did it. She kept looking at the stars. Caleb looked down at their hands for a moment. Then he turned his hand over slowly so that his palm was facing up, and her hand rested in his, and he closed his fingers gently around hers. Neither of them said anything for a while. Then Lyra said, still looking up at the stars, "I finished my thesis." Caleb turned to look at her. "When?" "This afternoon," she said. "I submitted it to the Interstellar Botanical Research Archive. Dr. Nath helped me with the final formatting." A small pause. "It has been accepted for publication." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Lyra, I dedicated it to you," she said. He stopped. She finally turned and looked at him. Her amber eyes in the dim light of the observation deck were very steady and very clear, and there was nothing in them now of that first cold exhaustion he had seen on the night they met. What was there instead was something he had watched grow slowly over many months, something that was warm and careful and entirely her own. "I want to read you what I wrote," she said. She picked up the tablet from her lap and looked at it for a moment. Then she read quietly and simply, "To the human who understood that freedom is not a reward, it is a right." The observation deck was very still. Outside, the stars were doing what stars always do, burning quietly and enormously in the dark, indifferent to the small and important things happening in their light. Caleb looked at Lyra for a long moment. There were many things he could have said. He was a person who worked with words every day, who built careful sentences for difficult situations, who knew how to say the right thing at the right time. But right now, in this quiet room, with her hand in his and those words still sitting in the air between them, he found that the right thing was not a long sentence at all. "Thank you," he said, softly and simply and completely. Lyra looked at him for a moment longer. Then she turned back to the stars, and she did not let go of his hand, and he did not let go of hers. Down on the lower levels of the station, life continued in all its noise and complication. Diplomats argued and scientists worked, and species that had once been strangers to each other passed in corridors and nodded, and sometimes even spoke. The galaxy was still large and difficult and full of things that needed fixing. But up here, in the quiet dark above all of it, two people from different stars sat together and watched the universe turn slowly around them. And between them, in the simple and unspoken way that real things grow, something had taken root. Something that had started with a chain being removed. Something that had grown in the space between a paper book and a small clay pot, and a plant that needed almost nothing to survive. Something that neither of them had planned or rushed or forced. Something that was, in the end, entirely free.